Hi guys, welcome to Heat Geek. Quite a special episode today. I'm joined by, Richard's probably going to disagree, but I'm going to say the world's leading expert on climate research, or perhaps the UK's, or certainly up there as one of the best. It's Professor Richard Betts MBE, PhD, ABC. What's your position within Exeter University?
So I'm a professor at the University of Exeter and a fellow at the Met Office. I'm a head of climate impacts research at the Met Office.
Head of Climate Impacts Research at Met Office, project director for the writing of the technical report for the UK's third National Climate Change Risk Assessment as well. Just list as long as your arm. So when we go in and talk about why we're doing decarbonising heating or decarbonising homes or getting an electric car, for example, there's a premise that makes it all, the whole reason we're doing it is to lower carbon in the atmosphere. If we're not, or we don't believe in that, then there's no point in doing that. Let's just use gas boilers, especially as energy prices are increasing. Renewables do make more sense, but the real premise is climate change. And every time we do a video, we get comments underneath, yes, but is it really real? You know, and then we'll have a chat about why this is the right thing to do. But we're kind of talking as non-experts. I don't go to a dentist to ask him about my heating system, for example. And on that subject, I've got Richard here to kind of explain some of the misconceptions away and give a bit more of a wholesome understanding of why we're doing what we're doing. And for those viewers who haven't seen us before, we are Heat Geek, and we basically look at how we can conserve energy in the home in the heating space. So we look at things like heat pumps, how you can refine your boiler controls or the way you use your boiler, or anything to do with heating to get the most out of it without consuming energy. So moving on, if it's okay with you, I'll just sort of crack on and ask you a few questions and basically ask you the questions that I get asked underneath these videos. And one of those is, and it really annoys me, I must say, is carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is absolutely fine because the plants love it. In fact, it increases plant growth. Is that true?
So carbon dioxide does increase plant growth, and I've published on that myself a lot, actually. But it also is a greenhouse gas, which means it warms the earth. And to some extent, the amount of carbon dioxide we have in the atmosphere before we started putting more in due to burning fossil fuels, that was keeping the earth warmer than it should have been. Without that, another greenhouse gases, the earth would have been frozen solid. So it has kept the earth warm enough for life, but we're building up carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, which is causing a problem, is making the earth too hot now. So yes, CO2 helps plants, but it also makes the climate warm, and that causes a major and ever-increasing problem.
So what specifically is bad about the planet being warmer? Like, I've quite enjoyed this summer. Why is that a bad thing?
Because we've set up our whole lives based on the climate as it used to be. So all our buildings are set up in this country for a certain level of warm summers, but not too hot, and mild winters, obviously keeping our homes warmer in winter and so on. So all our roads and our railways are built based on the levels of temperature that we've had previously. Around the world, everyone is set up for the climate that they are used to. An important fact is everyone is assuming the sea levels are where they are now. But if we warm the climate, as we are doing, we're melting the ice glaciers and some of the ice sheets. That expands the water in the oceans. That means sea level rises. That means that is causing increasing coastal flooding. So it's the fact that we are changing our own environment away from what we're used to that causes a problem. And in countries that are very hot, they're already on the edge of what is tolerable. So that is going to be, taking things over the edge if the world gets any hotter.
Okay.
So it is a serious problem.
Right, and then you've got issues like migration, and they're going to need somewhere to live, etc., and just people dying in general, which isn't nice, obviously.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. And that's obviously forgetting about habitats that obviously animals, etc., are used to.
Exactly.
They don't have aircon.
Yes, it's not just humans that are set up for living in the climate that as it used to be. All of the species are as well. The other thing, of course, about hot weather in the UK. As you say, it can be quite nice, a lovely warm sunny day and everything, go out and enjoy the beach. But we realised in the last month or so, wildfire is becoming an issue in this country. We saw many fires even in London, houses burning down because people's gardens setting on fire is just insane, really. So we're moving to a state we're not used to.
Yeah, we had actually three just up the road from here, three different separate fires. Okay, right now, I suppose the next question would be, what is the urgency on this? Like, are we talking like next year the planet's going to be on fire, or 100 years, or 300 years, or what? How urgent is this?
So it is urgent, but the urgency comes from the fact that when you put carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, it stays there for a long time. So as we keep building it up, it's building up on what's happened before. So it's not as if next year there'll be some super catastrophe which we can avoid by reducing emissions now. It's more the fact that further down the line we're committing to these bigger impacts. The impacts are already happening now. We just talked about wildfire, for example. So impacts are starting to happen now. But the more we put into the atmosphere, the more we're locking in these worse impacts further down the line. And that's why it's urgent.
Yeah, because further down the line, we're still going to have to produce some kind of carbon to get stuff done. So we've got less room, I suppose, in the future. So we're making our job easier. Wow, okay, that's interesting. So what's CP 2. I've seen it banded about. What's CP 2.6, CP 4.5? That's quite. Is that to do with that same thing, or they're central to this argument, right? Or
so there's these particular code names, if you like, for emissions scenarios, assumptions about what we might do in the future in terms of how much carbon we emit, because we can't predict how much carbon we're going to emit in the future, because it's a choice that we will make as a society. So what climate scientists do is look at these kind of what-if scenarios, and the scenarios are given names called RCPs, which stands for Representative Concentration Pathway. So it's not quite long-winded, but concentration being the concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and the pathway being the scenario. And there's one called RCP 2.6. 2.6 is the number which represents the change in the Earth's radiation balance. It's the strength of the greenhouse effect, essentially. The higher the number, the higher the greenhouse effect, the more the warming. RCP 2.6 is a low scenario, which assumes that we do take action fairly urgently and start to reduce global emissions within the next few years. There's one even lower than that, which is even more ambitious, but people are sceptical that that is even achievable. So RCP 2.6 may be one that we can achieve. At the other end of the scale, there's a very high scenario called RCP 8.5, which would be a very, very hot world by the end of the century, well over 4 or 5 degrees global warming. Fortunately, we're not on track for that. That would be higher than we are currently headed. It would be more kind of where we would have been 10 years ago if we hadn't started to change our ways, because we have started to reduce emissions.
Right. So let's say we have a world war, a more significant one. Is that still a possibility? 8.5.
Who knows? I mean, this is
because climate change goes out the window. Then you're fighting a war, aren't you?
Exactly. It's not possible to really, predict the future of economies. Because there's so many things, there's wars, you can't predict the outcome of elections. A very powerful country may get a particular leader which completely ignores climate change, which kind of happens in some countries recently. So you can't predict the future of an economy. You can't predict where emissions are going to go. So we look at this whole range of scenarios from low to high, very high emissions.
Right. So
in between.
I'm getting an idea of what you do now. So 8.5 is the world is burning by the end of the century. So within the next 80 years or just under 80 years. 2.6, how bad, if we do 2.6, which is, I'm guessing, quite a significant change for every home and person, what does that look like by the end of the century? How much temperature change would that equate to?
So that would still mean a global warming of between 1.5 and 2 degrees by the end of this century. Okay. So there's this international agreement called the Paris Agreement, which all the countries in the world have signed up to, which commits the world to try and limit global warming to well below 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels. Yes. We're currently at about 1.2 degrees above pre-industrial.
Right.
So the Paris Agreement aims to limit warming to well below 2 degrees, ideally aiming to limit warming to 1.5 degrees, which we're almost at. We could reach that within the next decade. or so, unless somehow we do reduce emissions massively quickly, but that's looking increasingly difficult. So somewhere between 1.5 and 2 degrees is where this low scenario probably...
So the best case scenario... So is the best case scenario 2.6, which is a massive change for all of us. If we all do as much as we can right now, we're going to just about make the Paris Agreement pledge.
Probably, yes. It really depends exactly what we and other countries do. Of course, this country can set an example to the rest of the world. Really. But so somewhere between 1.5 and 2 degrees global warming is it will be the best case scenario. Yeah.
And what's the current trajectory? Where are we shooting if we kind of just stay at the rough change that we're at the moment?
We're somewhere between these two extremes. We're probably heading for somewhere between about 2.5 and 3 degrees global warming by the end of the century, which is not good news. This would be major impacts. This would be increasing the number of people that we see affected by flooding. We've seen these dreadful floods in Pakistan in the last few days. Pakistan is one area where we are seeing an increase in rainfall quite clearly. That will only get worse. But also we're seeing other parts of the world seeing increasingly severe drought. China's had some dreadful droughts. The UK is in drought at the moment.
Well, the UK's had a lot of bad, serious rainfall as well.
Yeah.
So droughts in summer and floods in winter. It's literally worst end of both spectrums.
Yes, exactly. So the current trajectory is not good, and ongoing sea level rise as well, and that's really important because sea level takes a long time to respond fully because it takes a long time to melt a glacier, for example. Even if you stabilise the temperature, the glacier is going to keep gradually melting for decades or even centuries, save for an ice sheet. So you could be locking in these further changes in the long term. So we want to avoid this kind of 3 degree world that we're currently heading for.
So at the moment we're on track for RCP 5.5 to 6.5 or whatever those numbers were, somewhere in the middle there, roughly, if we continue at this rate of change. How long has that got? Is that a manageable amount, or is that beyond? Do we need to still get down from that point?
So we're currently on track for scenarios somewhere between RCP 4.5 and 6.0, where these numbers mean the change in the Earth's radiation balance. These are not good news because that would still give us warming of between 2.5 and 3 degrees global warming by the end of the century. So that would still be major impacts. So we're still not on track to avoid the worst yet. So we do need to reduce emissions faster than where we're currently heading.
So is this to do with what they call the feedback loop? What's the feedback loop?
So there's several types of feedback. So feedback is where you get feedbacks in electrical systems as well. You have an input to the system that has an effect which affects something else, which then feeds back on the original input, if you like. So these feedbacks happen in electronics. They also happen in the climate system. So you can have a warming effect, the warming of the climate, which can, for example, cause increased forest fires. The Amazon is one region where fires are causing an emission of carbon dioxide. Fires are more likely if the climate is hotter and drier. So you get warming of the climate, more forest fires, release of the carbon to the atmosphere, and a more enhanced warming. So that's part of the feedback loop. You see, there's other things like if you lose the ice sheets or ice, say you lose sea ice in the Arctic, the ice in the Arctic, because it's white and reflective, it reflects sunlight back to space. So that keeps the Arctic cool. As you lose the sea ice, you get the darker ocean exposed. So more of the sunlight is absorbed by the ocean. That warms the ocean. And that's another feedback loop. So these high scenarios like RCP 8.5 we were talking about, they could happen not only because of high emissions, but also because of feedbacks from, say, the loss of the Amazon forest, the loss of carbon from permafrost areas as they start to thaw out and so on. So these feedbacks could make matters worse as well. So we want to avoid those kicking in.
Okay, right. So, it sounds pretty bad. So we're looking at more flooding, in the UK, more flooding in winter as well, just to make it more relevant to the bulk of audience, and droughts more in the summer. But also CO2, as we teach on our channels, it's relevant to what we do. It acidifies water, right? So it kills the ocean at the same time. Is it killing the ocean just because of acidification, or is it the temperature as well? Like, what's the?
So it's both, and the acidification is particularly bad for corals because coral relies on making calcium carbonate. So the whole skeleton is made of calcium carbonate, and that means the ocean waters need to be not too acidic, slightly alkaline, in fact, as they are at the moment.
Right.
If more carbon dioxide is absorbed in the ocean waters, that makes the oceans less alkaline, more acidic. That makes it more difficult for the coral to build its skeleton. It also affects some types of plankton as well. So ocean acidification, as well as warming, is bad news for ocean organisms.
So plankton is obviously right at the beginning of the food chain. So if we're talking about reducing plankton levels, the knock-on effect of that could be, on top of the potential overfishing, et cetera, that's happening, it could be huge because that eventually makes its way to land, doesn't it? So I suppose it's not what we see, it's also what we don't directly correlate.
Yeah, exactly. There's a huge, complex network of the food chain and everything relying on everything else, and it's really impossible to predict fully how this will all play out. But we're taking massive risks by interfering in this way.
So, like, in your role or in a climate scientist role, what do you actually do? Like, how do you take the measurements, or like, is it all theoretical, or how do you do climate science?
So in the Met Office Hadley Centre where I work, which is the UK's national kind of climate science centre, we have lots of people working, dozens, maybe even a couple of hundred, on the climate models, but also on weather observations. And also we work with a lot of people that study the world in other different areas, like study the Amazon rainforest, the Congo rainforest, and all parts of the world. So the modelling part, that's actually the same as the models you see on the weather forecast. The Met Office does the weather forecast every day, of course, if you've seen. This is all done with computer models which represent the motion of the atmosphere and the clouds formation and the production of rain and so on in the form of well-known laws of physics. Very, very basic fundamental laws of physics, which are represented as mathematical equations, which you can turn into computer code. We actually use a language called Fortran, which is very old. It's not a modern language, but it's for computing, but it's very, very important in science because of the way it's set up, and it's good for working in a huge team because hundreds of people working on this. So we use these computer models, the same models which are used to produce the weather forecast every day. Basically, you keep the model going for 100 years with an assumption of how much carbon is built up, or you can even use it to reproduce the past climate of the last 100 years, putting in the observed climate and showing that it does the right thing. These models have been going for decades now. The older ones, produced, say, 50 years ago, did broadly correctly predict the warming of the world. So predictions made in the 1970s have come true. You could also reproduce even older climates from thousands or even millions of years ago with these models, so we can study past climates. But these are linked with all the data to get the data, all the observations that come in from around the world every hour, every minute, every day.
And I suppose you can ice cores. Do you get involved in taking the ice cores out? Because that is my understanding is that you can measure what the concentration of CO2 was historically. Is that right?
Yes. So organisations like the British Antarctic Survey and others, they will drill down into the ice, deep down into the ice, and the ice is built up in layers. As it snowed, the snow traps bubbles of air, and as the snow turns into ice, the air is trapped in there, so you can measure the CO2 concentration. Also, the type of oxygen in there, there's something called isotopes, different types of oxygen molecule, basically, that can tell you what the temperature was back then as well. So you can reproduce the past climate from this data.
Right.
So we can see that the world has got warmer and cooler over time through natural cycles of ice ages. So this is well understood. So we could also put the warming of the world that we're seeing now in the context of these past changes that have been seen.
And you cross-reference to make sure that you're accurate. So, and anyone else could, obviously you need to go to university, but you can go back and check what you've done and it will align. So exactly. On that point, who's paying you to do this? Is it renewables companies that want to sell more solar panels that are paying you to come up with this results? Or, where does the money come from? Because that's the thing that I get, underneath the comments, in the comment section. This is all a scam by the renewables industry to make money, which obviously they have less money than fossil fuels.
Yeah. The Met Office is funded by the UK government with a National Weather Service, a National Climate Service. The climate research is funded largely by the Department of Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy, BEIS, which has responsibility for climate science and also for energy.
Yes.
But we are required to be the authoritative source of information on climate science. DEFRA, the Department for Environment, also fund us as well. I also work at the University of Exeter, and we get funding through the research councils for fundamental research there. So it's all scientific research, and we are asked to be completely objective. This is the whole point. We haven't got any axe to grind. Scientists just want to get to the truth.
Of course.
We're not acting for any industry body.
And importantly, if someone wanted to check this, they could go to university, they could study how to do the study and just retrack what you've done, and they should come up with the same results, right? So it's all written down. So another argument another argument that I get is the Earth does move in cycles. There has been historical ice ages. We're just coming out of another ice age. So what's your response to that argument?
Well, my response is, first of all, you know that because climate scientists have told you that. So this is not news to us. As I say, we study the climate over all time scales, going back into the distant past as well as what's happening in the future. So we understand what's caused climate change in the past, so changes in the shape of the Earth's orbit, change in the tilt of the Earth, various feedback processes which have caused the Earth to get hotter and colder over the millions of years. This is all well understood. This is all factored into our models, but none of these can explain what's happening at the moment. The sun is not heating up at the moment, for example. The sun cannot explain the warming that we're seeing. It's completely indisputable the world is getting warmer. Nobody doubts that fact. And the theory of the greenhouse effect, again, it's not just a theory, it's a fact. It's very well understood. It's a well-established scientific fact that certain gases keep the Earth warmer than it would have been otherwise, and we're increasing those gases. This is just a scientific fact.
Right. So I think most people agree with the scientific facts of the greenhouse effect, but I suppose the question, as we're all aware, is the man-made effect of that. So how certain are we on that? I remember there was the consensus paper which said I think it said 97%. That's a commonly known figure, isn't it? I think that was back in 2013 from memory.
Yeah. So this paper did a survey of thousands of scientific papers to establish what the level of agreement was between climate scientists, and it came out with this figure of 97%. But actually, that's probably an underestimate. The consensus is probably higher than that. Nobody seriously disputes the basic science of it. Some people will perhaps say, we can adapt to it, or the changes won't be so severe in the future. That's where there is, some parts of the scientific community will be saying, yes, it may be less severe, but that's they're in a minority. But it's all about the level of severity of what's coming rather than the actual basics, which is not really disputed. And the fact that it's human caused, the buildup of CO2 in the atmosphere, we're certain that's our fault, because we're actually emitting more than enough carbon to explain the buildup of CO2 that we've seen. We've actually emitted twice as much to account for what we've seen in the buildup in the atmosphere. The other half has been absorbed by the oceans, causing acidification, as we said earlier, or being taken up by plants, as has been pointed out as we started the conversation. Right. Plants grow better under higher CO2. So half of our emissions are being reabsorbed by the plants and the oceans. So it's completely obvious that the CO2 rise we're seeing in the atmosphere is due to what we are doing, because nature is taking carbon out of the atmosphere and not putting it in.
Brilliant. Fantastic. So, I mean, the 97% thing, that's 9 years old. It's probably more like 99.9 or something now anyway, I would guess, because... and yeah, like you say, the other 3%, it might be, yes, they agree that it's man-made, but it's that we can adapt or whatever. Yeah, I suppose all these things are always more complicated than on the surface, aren't they? So the worst case scenario, or the worser case scenario of RCP 8.5, said that right? Yeah. We're looking at the end of the century, pretty grim. How long have we got in the RCP 2.6 scenario? Like till the world dissolves, or is that going to be fine forever?
So, with the low scenario, the RCP 2.6 scenario, that would involve the global temperatures kind of stabilising.
Right. So it halts.
We wouldn't get this ongoing warming. We would have to live with a warmer world.
Right.
But it's not going to kind of keep warming and warming beyond our capacity.
Right. Okay. Then. So here's another question as part of that: is this reversible? Can we come back down to, if we want to, come back down to a slightly lower temperature?
We could, over a long period of time, like decades or centuries.
Right.
We'd have to be taking carbon out of the atmosphere actively. If we were to magically stop all carbon emissions immediately, like now, the global temperature, it would cease to rise, but it wouldn't start falling straight away. What we'd have to do would be to be taking carbon out of the atmosphere. The CO2 stays up there for a long time, you see. So the natural systems, forests and the oceans, would be taking carbon out of the atmosphere gradually. We'd have to accelerate that by planting more forests or by using technology to suck CO2 out of the atmosphere. So we could actually, in theory, do that. We could reduce global temperatures by bringing CO2 back out of the atmosphere. Right. It would take a long time.
Yeah. And I suppose the world could kind of adapt in that time as well, so the urgency is less important. Okay, so what can we do as people? So you talked about potentially reforestation, essentially is what you just mentioned there. Planting more plants. I mean, is planting more plants and trees, that is a good thing to do, right? It does make a difference, or...
It does help, but it's not a solution by itself. And of course, if you've planted a whole forest and then it burns down to the forest fire, you've lost all that carbon anyway. So we can't rely on that. But it's nice to have woodlands and vegetation and greenery anyway. It's good for biodiversity. So it's good to have more forests and woodlands, in my opinion. So what we need to do is transform the energy system to get away from fossil fuels. We need to stop burning coal, oil and gas. The UK burns very little coal. We need to get rid of that completely. We need to get away from gas and oil as well, because these are fossil fuels which are putting more carbon into the atmosphere. So we need to get away from burning fossil fuels in our energy system, also in our transport system as well, getting away from using petrol and diesel vehicles, because they're putting carbon into the atmosphere as well. So these are two major things that we need to do.
Actually, just on that note, if anyone's watching this for the first time, this is basically what we kind of help with. This is our kind of input. The name Heat Geek suggests it. We look at how you can minimize the carbon impact of your home heating system, which is kind of the biggest challenge we have. Most carbon comes from homes, and in homes, most carbon comes from heating. So if you're interested in that, that's what we do. Please subscribe. And we kind of talk you through from free, easy, simple processes to reduce your usage down to how you can implement perhaps a renewable energy or any other sort of aspects around that. So please hit like, subscribe if that sort of takes your fancy. So Richard, Met Office. It's interesting you say Met Office, because that's where we get all weather data from, and because it is one and the same, and I hadn't ever thought that before. Where does the Met Office sort of sit, like, internationally? Is that like, the UK Met Office is like a shining example, or are we part of a much bigger global structure that kind of join forces?
So we are part of a big international collaboration, but the Met Office does have a leading role internationally in climate science. So the Met Office Hadley Centre where I work is regarded as one of the world's leading climate science centres, but climate science and weather in general is a huge team effort, because you need the data from around the world. You need experts in their own local climates. So nobody works in isolation. We work with countries across Europe, Brazil, India, the USA, China, everywhere. It's a huge international effort because it's the globe that we're talking about. It's the global climate. It's the world that we're talking about here. So everyone does work together on this to try and improve our understanding and take action.
So if someone was paid to give false data to prove a narrative, it wouldn't marry up with everyone else's data. They it kind of goes to show how open and honest it is.
It's very easy to check all our data. Our papers are published and they can be read and checked, and the data is made available. It's an idea that people are fiddling results for some hidden cause is just ridiculous. And this actually works both ways, because sometimes we get conspiracy theorists saying we're kind of hiding some deep, dark truth about the end of the world as well, which is also not true. We are not past some tipping point, which means everything's going to go out of control. We can still solve this. So we are just being completely open and honest on this, and we're giving everyone the scientific truth that there is a problem, but we can deal with it.
Right. Positive spin on this. Recently, energy price hikes, and I know that's not a positive thing to talk about, but a net positive effect is people are turning to look at solar panels, heat pumps, etc. And there's kind of been more of a global interest. I don't know if the results measurable already, and can you see change? Can you see something happening?
Over the last few years, we've seen global emissions rising more slowly. They were shooting up quite dramatically in the 2000s. This decade, they've still been rising, but not as dramatically. But we're not seeing an overall fall in emissions yet. What we did see, of course, in the COVID pandemic in 2020, we saw a temporary drop in emissions worldwide in the first 6 months of 2020. But that was short-lived. People stopped driving around, stopped flying around and everything, and there's an economic impact which reduced emissions, but things have bounced back since then. So we're still increasing our emissions, not as fast as we used to be. We're still increasing them, but we are seeing increased take-up of renewable technology in many parts of the world, and many countries are putting in place promises and pledges to really cut emissions. So we are seeing some signs of progress, and actually it's been shown as in all different sectors, in energy, transport, housing, the solutions exist already which could halve emissions within a decade. So we do have the tools available now. It's just getting on and doing it.
It's an interesting subject, and one that I was talking about recently. So if we're looking at a home, is the example I give, what's the target to reduce energy or reduce carbon or carbon dioxide output? At the moment, probably most people, it is energy, because energy's really expensive. But if you take a 10 kilowatt house and half the heat loss by putting in a load of insulation, you've halved the amount of energy you require and halved your carbon dioxide output. If you instead spent that money on a heat pump, you'll probably have around about a third of the carbon output. So actually, you'll probably use less energy, but you'll have a third of the previous carbon dioxide output. So this is something we kind of need to focus on, like moving forward. What's more important, reducing energy or reducing carbon? Because if you've got unlimited free clean energy, you can ramp up production if you like, or live in kind of more exotic lifestyle, or however you want to phrase it. But the target for me is carbon. Having said that, the big spin on that is energy prices at the moment, which are just insane.
The other important point here, though, is something called the urban heat island effect. So waste heat from houses and buildings actually warms your local area. So in London, for example, central London will stay warmer, especially at night, because of the heat escaping from buildings. And that's obviously an extra problem on top of global warming.
Is it heat escaping from buildings?
If we just keep using the same amount of energy and releasing waste heat to the environment, will still warm our local environment, even if that's from renewables.
Right.
So reducing energy is also important.
Okay, so So the damage of a local temperature increase is bad for local species and things, or what suffers from that apart from
making it life uncomfortable for ourselves? So
and if it's hotter, we're going to have to turn on the aircon, which uses more energy, which releases more carbon, etc. So I suppose there's another feedback loop. Is it just the properties that release heat? So thank you for that. I've made a little note of that one. Is it just that, or is there also the fact you've got the thermal mass of concrete, which literally stores the heat, and then if there's more concrete in a concentrated area, it's going to store it?
That is an important part of it as well.
Right.
Yes. So buildings absorb the heat in the daytime and then release it at night. The nights get warmer in an urban area for that reason. So it's both of these things happening. Yeah.
I'll change my argument for insulation. And that was not an argument against insulation, I might add, because insulation works very well with heat pumps because it means you can run at lower temperatures, you get higher efficiencies, you buy less energy. So if there's anything you could say to the climate change deniers in our comment section, what would that be?
I would say do step back and just have a think about this from a common sense perspective. Why would scientists be lying to you? We're not. All our work can be checked out. We don't have any axe to grind. Some of these things that we're coming up with are uncomfortable, unfortunately, and people naturally push back against these. Sometimes you don't want to accept some things which may be bad news. But the point is, it's important to understand what is really going on so we can do something about it. But there's no hidden agenda here. All our stuff can be checked, and we're always happy to come and chat about it as we are doing now.
So, Richard, where can our viewers find you on Twitter, for example, and perhaps your publications? Where would they go for all of that?
Yes, I'm Richard A. Betts on Twitter. So look me up there. You can see me talking about all kinds of stuff to do with climate change. Also, my other hobbies like music and cycling. I'm very into cycling, actually, which I don't have a car. I choose not to have a car because I find it easy to get around my local area. My bike is better for my health, it's better for the environment, and so on.
Where do you live?
I live in Exeter.
Oh, obviously. Okay.
In Devon, yes.
Richard, once again, thank you so much. Absolutely honoured to have you on. Perhaps if we do more future stuff, you'd be interested in joining us again?
Absolutely, yes. I love what you guys do, so keep it up. It's great.
Thank you. That's much appreciated, bud. If you're a heating engineer and looking to upskill, we also do an online course. It's quite a big, difficult course, and it is that for a reason, because certification in the Heat Geek course means you are extra special. You go on the Heat Geek map, and you are praised as someone who'd be very good at refining people's controls to minimize energy usage and carbon and potentially. If you liked this episode, obviously check through our playlists, hit like and make sure you subscribe, and I'll see you on the next one.